I'm really excited to have this chance to talk about my work. So I chose a title for this talk that encompasses actually two separate research papers that I think are related. And so my goal would be to try to give what is quite similar to a regular academic talk. And as we often do in economics, interruption is welcome. Questions are welcome at any point. In fact, I think most of us feel a bit scared if we don't get questions within the first 10 minutes or maybe 5 that people are not following. So feel free to raise your hand, and then I know that there's going to be Q&As at the end as well. And that's, I look forward to hear your thoughts about this topic. So economists that have been interested in the family and marriage markets have emphasized that marriage markets play an important role in determining a lot of choices in our economic lives. For example, and this is what we're going to talk a lot about today, for example, decisions regarding whether to invest in education, what opportunities people have to share risk, or decisions regarding how many children to have, whether to educate them or not, and so on. And so when I started working in this field of the economics of the family, I was mostly focusing on data from countries like the United States. And there, we often are interested in studying the effect of different policies. But when I started working, particularly in Zambia, which is where a lot of the data, some of the data from this work will come from, I realized that more than government policy, what is regulating the way in which family interactions work are not formal laws, but often a set of traditional institutions and culture that affect many aspects of people's lives, including the family. And so there's a lot of research in economics. I'll just talk about a few of these institutions. For instance, most rules regarding who can inherit under what circumstances is not really regulated by governmental law. I have a paper about this in Zambia, for example. The constitution will have some provisions about inheritance of land, but in practice that only covers the 5% of land that is under a statutory regulation, where the remainder of the land can be inherited only according to what the chiefs decide, which depends on historical traditions. There's also cultural norms regarding where a young couple will move when marriage takes place, which, as many economists have argued, matters for decisions to invest in their human capital. Even when you think about separation or divorce, it is often, or the general sort of rules of the marriage, it will revolve often around institutions. And in this talk in particular, I will talk about one specific institution that plays, in our view, in my view and one of my co-authors that I will tell you about soon, plays an important role in shaping decisions regarding marriage and human capital, and that's marriage payments. What are marriage payments are defined as payments that take place at the time of marriage, normally from one side of the marriage, could be the male side, to the female side. So I will often talk about male and female as the two sides of the market because that's the most common, vastly more common instance in the developing world. And so when the payments go from the groom to the bride side, we talk about a bride price. That's how bride wealth also, that's how anthropologists have defined this type of transfer. When we think about a payment that goes from the bride side to the groom side, we will talk about dowry. And so this talk is going to be mostly about the role of this institution in shaping important human capital decisions. But first, before I sort of dive into the papers, I wanted to give you a bit of a flavor of what my field of research is, and I'm going to, in order to do that, I'm going to refer to a beautiful quote from Gary Becker's Nobel lecture which define the economics of the family as an approach that interprets several economic decisions and generally relationships between family members through the lenses of economic theory, if we want to be general. In particular, in many instances, through the lenses of forward-looking behavior of agents that are maximizing utility and are interacting on the market. And I see some puzzled faces, so we'll see exactly what that, an application of that in a few minutes, but as I've said, questions are welcome. So the talk today then is going to be how can we, at the end of the day, so how can we use these tools of the economics of the family to talk about human capital investments in developing countries. And so to quote our former Secretary of Treasury, Larry Summers, the world's best investment, the education of young girls in particular, which is going to be the focus of one of the papers that I'll talk about. So without further ado, I'll jump into the first paper. And so as I mentioned, I'm going to go with a set of slides that I have not really adjusted too much to what I would give to an audience of faculty. So I know you guys can take it, but if you want any clarification, feel free to interrupt me at any point. So the first paper that I'll talk about is joint with Nava Ashraf, Natalie Bao, and Nathan Nunn. And the title is Bride Price and Female Education, and it's just now actually forthcoming. And the premise of the paper is that, as I started the talk describing, marriage markets might have consequences for people's incentives to invest in education. I think lots of economists will agree that this theory has been proposed in many settings, including historically in the United States, to think about women's education in a time where they were unlikely to work. The challenge to measuring what these returns to education in the marriage market are is that normally we can't observe them directly. In the type of models that we think about in economics, we'll think there may exist returns coming in the form of more access to resources in the household, a better partner, more say in household decision making, but as you can imagine, lots of these are difficult to observe. An exception, in our view, is when you have transfers that you can actually observe. So in this sense, the marriage payments institution that I was telling you about, and in particular, the practice of bride price, which remember is a payment going from the groom to the bride's family at the time of marriage, that's widespread throughout both sub-Saharan Africa and many parts of Southeast Asia, gives us an opportunity basically to observe potential returns that families can accrue on the marriage market when they educate their daughters. So what's interesting also in terms of studying these payments is that, first of all, they're very common, as I described earlier. They're large in amounts, so often exceeding 1 year of GDP per capita in many of the countries where the practice exists. They're also, in many respects, controversial and have been the subject of a lot of policy debate, particularly in countries like Uganda, for example, where there have been calls for abolishment of this payment. And as we'll see, particularly in the paper that I will talk about later, there are certainly indications that these payments might influence decisions in ways that can be problematic. But in addition to sort of these more problematic aspects of this practice, we were also interested in exploring another interpretation, or at least another way in which the presence of this payment can influence households. And that is, particularly if you talk, was very clear to us working in the field in Zambia, and if you read the anthropology literature, this theme comes up over and over again. The fact that there is a payment that the groom pays to the bride's family upon marriage is a way to reward the parents for the type of investments that they have undertaken in their daughters. Obviously, that doesn't change many of the more controversial aspects of this practice, but as economists, we're mostly interested in understanding and exploring all possible mechanisms before we can think about advising policymakers on how to best address an issue. And so our hypothesis, based initially on our own qualitative work and also on the anthropology literature, was that if the tradition of bride price rewards parents for investing in daughters, it might also raise parental incentives to invest in the education of their daughters and therefore influence their decisions to send a daughter to school. And so if that is the case, just to give you a bit of an overview of where this paper is going, if indeed it is the case that having this additional incentives is a factor in decision regarding education, it might also generate heterogeneity in how households respond to investments made by the government with the goal of making education more accessible to low-income households. And so to look at this point, in this paper we revisit what is one of the best studies, sort of really quite important school expansion program in the developing world, which is a program that took place in Indonesia in the 1970s and that expanded access to primary school throughout the country. And that the program per se, sort of the average effect of the program is extensively studied in a very influential paper by Alessandra Voena, the very recent Nobel laureate in economics. And in that paper, which was mostly focused on then the returns to education, but used the school construction to expand education levels to then study its effect on wages, the effects were concentrated on men. So as we're going to see in this paper, when you look at women, while on average you fail to observe that the school construction program expanded female education, when you zoom in into the ethnic groups that practice bride price payments, so that have this tradition where the parents get rewarded, well, that's at least our interpretation, when their daughter is educated, there we'll see just as large effects on female education as has been documented on men. So I'll tell you a bit more about this as the talk unfolds. Another thing that we do in this paper is we replicate this exercise in a different country. So we'll use data from Zambia, where we were able to collect some data ourselves in the field. And we think it's important to attempt to validate findings, particularly when they build on theoretical predictions in multiple contexts. All right, so let me give you a bit of a sense of sort of what variation we're talking about here. This is a map of Indonesia, and the darker spots are areas of the country where a larger fraction of the population engages traditionally, according to ethnographers, in bride price payments. So in the less dark areas, there's typically no marriage payment taking place, or there are simply symbolic payments that are less likely to vary with the characteristics of the partners. In Zambia, we find a similar degree of dispersion of traditional practices with certain areas, for example, the sort of urban areas around the capital city of Lusaka and some areas in the northern provinces having a more ingrained tradition of making these payments. So what we're going to do is combine, and I'm not for in the interest of time, I'm not going to get into the details of all the data sources, but if you're curious, it's in the paper. Basically a lot of our work is really sitting down and programming for hours and hours on our computers, so a lot less glamorous than one might guess at first, but very interesting in my view. So our exercise requires combining data sets from multiple sources, so this will be both data sets regarding the educational outcomes in Indonesia and in Zambia, as well as data about where the schools are constructed, coming from the literature, or data that we obtain ourselves working with the Zambian Ministry of Education, and data on these actual marriage payments, and combine them with ethnographic data that tells us what the ancestors of each respondent in our data did in terms of marriage payments. Did they practice bride price, which might then predict that this practice exists today as well, and this is something we can test, or if it did not have a bride price practice. I'll start by telling you a little bit about our theoretical model that guides us in this analysis and help us explain what we've postulated, we have hypothesized. Ismail?
Can I have just a clarification?
Yes.
In the sense that you say that it's desirable to have good education, so because education is something that people are going to like on the market.
Yes.
Right? Mm-hmm. I have this tendency to believe that in some African countries, they tend to think that women education has a kind of slope, so it's desirable when it's reached one level. She's getting too much educated. It's not much likely that she's going to get married. So do the parents think about optimal level of education, or you think that is increasing?
No, this is a very good question, and I'll tell you. So this paper is about primary school. And so when I talk about education, it's going to be a binary decision to send your child to primary school or not. In terms of the theory, as you'll see, we assume that primary schooling increases the value, the marital output. As a matter of fact, when we regress a woman's education against the bride price paid, there is a strictly monotonic relationship. But in our sample, particularly, for example, in Zambia, where we collected data in peri-urban Lusaka, no woman in our sample actually has a college degree. So this is up to high school, we continue seeing a monotonic. Another important assumption that you'll see is that by and large in our samples, men are more likely to be educated than women. So that's going to have implications for the equilibrium. Thanks, very good question. Okay, so our model has two periods. The first one, period 1, which should be seen as basically the childhood of our boys and girls whose education we're interested in examining. The parents decide whether to send their children to primary school. And then in the second period, the children match in the marriage market. And then if the child belongs to a family that traditionally practices bride price, the marriage transfer, the way in which basically the marriage market clears gets appropriated by the bride's parents in the form of a bride price. If there is no bride price addition, that marriage market price stays with the woman in the form of greater intra-household allocation. So you can see why some NGOs might be concerned about this practice, because it gives parents property rights over the marriage transfer rather than leaving it with the woman. At the same time, the bride price then acts basically as an intergenerational transfer from the younger generation to the oldest, and so can have some dynamic implication in terms of a incentive to invest in education. So our first prediction, and that builds again on the work of groundbreaking work of Gary Becker and Shapley Shubik, all winning the Nobel Prize, among other things for this, is if we think about a marriage market in which people can just match in a frictionless fashion, and there's gains from marrying somebody more educated, and these gains are higher for more educated people, then we should expect what we call assortative mating, meaning more educated people marrying each other and less educated people marrying each other. When you're in an economy, like we see in many sub-Saharan African countries still in the present day, where men are more likely to be educated than women are, then there'll be fewer educated women. In our equilibrium, everyone marries, and these few educated women are going to be in high demand. They're all going to match with an educated man, and they're going to command a higher, well, that's going to be the second prediction, they're going to command a higher bride price payment. But the third prediction is we should expect that the fact that you pay this bride price or not should have no implication on whether people match assortatively. Yes?
That actually the average education women gets is less than men gets. So how does this education equilibrium achieve that? Like just like the relative of level of education in his or her own gender, or like the absolute years of education?
So think about it's a dichotomic variable, which is you go to primary school or not. So the microphone.
Yes, don't get a microphone.
Oh, I see. Yeah. So maybe you can repeat your. Maybe you can get a couple more minutes then at the end. But I'll start making my diagram while you repeat the question. So imagine this is female, and this is male. So these are the primary education equal to 1. This is the primary education equal to 1. We just use a slightly different notation. So what this is saying, this is, oh, please maybe repeat the question so that people can hear it.
Okay, thank you. So my question was, given the discrepancy in women and men's average education level, how is the equilibrium of educated women with educated men reached?
Yeah, and that's a useful clarification question. So when I say educated, I just mean that the dichotomic variable that captures whether you finished primary school is 1 or not, is on or off, basically. So the fraction, so imagine this is a measure of men and measure of women in the marriage market, basically the population of men and women in the marriage market, and you have more men who are educated than women, but everybody marries. All the educated women will marry educated men, but some educated men are going to have to marry uneducated women. So there's going to be a bit of a race to get these educated women because there's a complementarity between on having a marriage between two educated people. So the first prediction is this assortative mating. In practice, as we see in the data, that there's a lot of sorting in the data, but having completed primary school strongly predict marrying somebody with a primary school degree, but that doesn't vary on whether your ancestors made bride price payments or not, which, by the way, in our data strongly predicts whether these payments are still made in the present day, but we're using the historical variable to eliminate confounds, given that the payment itself is an equilibrium outcome. The second prediction coming from this model is that because it is desirable to marry an educated woman in our model, the bride price payment will be higher when a woman is more educated, which follows on what we were saying earlier. So if we use a large data set from Indonesia and a smaller one that we collect ourselves in Zambia. So to each coefficient, we'll identify the additional Syrian return from education, where the dependent variable is how much bride price is paid. So basically, if you complete primary school, and even more so if you complete junior secondary, and even more so if you complete senior secondary, your parents will receive a higher payment. And that's also true in peri-urban Lusaka, where actually we don't have a ton of data, but this monotonic pattern is preserved. Of course, we're very worried about making sure that we can control for everything that we can, because there may be unobserved characteristics of the woman correlated with her education that determine how much is paid. So those of you who have taken econometrics know that estimating returns to education in the marriage market is a lot of work. And so there's caveats to that. Following up also on what you were asking earlier, we asked parents in our survey in Lusaka, first of all, what they thought was the most important determinant of the price that is paid upon marriage, and the majority of respondents list education as one of the top 3 determinants of the payment. So it seems to be certainly something in parents' mind. So hopefully that can alleviate some identification concerns that I think we'll never completely get rid of. But and last, we wanted to know, why is it the case? Why do parents think that this payment is typically going up, is higher when a woman is educated? And so interesting, we started by not prompting people, just asking an open-ended question. This is a sample of 714 households in peri-urban Lusaka. And what's interesting is that the vast majority of people, when they're not prompted, they say what we've heard over and over again, which is, well, of course the payment is higher when the woman is more educated because the parents deserve to be compensated. And in fact, I think normally this is done sort of looking as, when I ask people, in the field, I'm always rightfully, I think, saying, isn't this obvious? Like, well, it's obvious to me, but I need to convince a lot of other people. So let me ask it to 714 people. And then once we prompt with reasons why basically there is value in this education in the marriage, then lots of people think that a woman's, as we might expect, a woman's education is very important, not only in the labor market, but even more so in terms of her ability in the household. Tian. Tian. Sorry? Yeah.
Why don't the men collude to keep the price low? So if you have culture being the mechanism that...
There's competition for educated women.
But if there's a culture that can act as a mechanism to enforce a bride price, why not use that mechanism to say we're going to keep women artificially underpaid relative to what they deserve?
Well, I think the problem is if you have fewer educated women and educated men, the men who otherwise have to marry a less educated woman would want to undercut the men that are paying less. So you cannot, I mean, at least in a competitive equilibrium, you couldn't sustain. You would need some form of punishment that is sort of outside of our framework. But
I guess the question is the cultural practice. Why does that
I mean, the point is that the practice itself is the one of paying to reward the parents. So I think that's why. But yeah, no, this is an interesting question. Okay, so moving on with a few more predictions. I guess I'll focus on the main ones in the interest of time. In this model, because of this additional return that you can capture as a parent from educating your daughter, you're more likely to send your daughter to school. So education rates among ethnic groups that engage in bride price payments should be higher than in other ethnic groups. And so we can look in the data, again, sort of controlling for a vector of potential confounds. We look at the various data sets from Indonesia and from Zambia, and across the board we see that indeed primary school completion rates are significantly larger in many, particularly in the larger samples, when a woman belongs to an ethnic group and engages in bride price payments. The main prediction, though, of the model is going to be one about the interaction between this practice and the investments of the government to expand the supply of schools. And our model predicts that, particularly because we're in economies with low rates of education at baseline, a decline in the cost of schooling will bring into schools more girls coming from ethnic groups that make bride price payments as opposed to girls coming from other ethnic groups. And actually, this assumption is quite important. So we should not expect that this will be true everywhere. It will be true when education rates are low in a very specific way that I'm happy to discuss if you have questions about it. But so we revisit this very famous Duflo result, but focusing on women. So as I mentioned earlier, in accordance with the literature, we see that on average, the expansion of schools, so this is an interaction between how many schools were built in a given district and whether the girl belongs to a cohort that was exposed to the school construction rather than older cohorts that could not benefit from it. On average, we fail to see an effect on this expansion, but when we focus on groups that engage in bride price as opposed to groups that don't, the groups that engage in bride price payments respond even more actually than the men do in the original paper. This is just basically a graphical argument of the same point, which exploits the fact that when the schools were constructed, some girls were young enough to still be able to take advantage of the school expansion, and some were too old. And so among the bride price groups, we see this increase in primary school completion that's not present for other ethnic groups. We replicate, and now in the interest of time, I'm not going to go as much in the details of the Zambian program, which is a less well-studied program. In fact, we obtained data for the first time from the Ministry of Education to study this question. But even when Zambia expanded the supply of schools in the early 2000s, The main ethnic groups that seem to take advantage of this increased expansion were bright price groups. One last prediction that I think gives us, both reassures us that when we look at it empirically, that our results are not driven maybe by confounds, but also shows us the power of economic theory, is the prediction that everything that we've said about girls should not go through when it comes to boys. And the reason is, if you have competition for the educated girl, it's costly for a man to match with a desirable high education woman. And so he is going to have to pay, either in the form of bride price or in the form of transfers within the marriage, more to match with a high quality woman. And so in equilibrium will be indifferent between marrying a high educated or a low educated woman. And so the practice of bride price should have no effect on men's education. Yes?
Thank you. So we have seen that there's actually great geographical differentials existing between different areas in Zambia. And I don't know that in your research, do you consider like geographical mobility of men and women in the marriage market? Will men prefer to choose, well, a girl less educated but in his neighborhood instead of some women but more educated but live far away?
Well, that's an interesting question. So one thing that I should clarify, and maybe wasn't so clear at all when I said it, is even though in this picture I'm showing where the groups are concentrated, we're not just using geographic variation. We're using the variation at the household level. So we can put some geographic identifiers and say even within a given Zambian province, so people who live relatively close by are exposed to similar labor markets and so on. As you can see, there'll be people who practice bride price and people who don't. And so that's where our variation will be coming from. So it's not just a geographic variation. It's within relatively broadly defined relatively finely defined geographic areas. In terms of migration, no, we haven't thought about how people would trade off. Actually, I have a student who was thinking about that for her thesis in the United States. So it's an very interesting question. But I think in this instance, marriage migration, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, is not as common as in other parts of the world. And actually, that will bring me to the next paper. So you'll see that. Okay, so anyway, we said what the model predicts that we shouldn't see what we observe happening for women happen to a similar extent for the men, and that's an equilibrium result. So it wasn't something that was obvious to us. We actually kept being asked at every seminar, what happens to the men? What happens to the men? And we always thought, well, this is a paper about women's education. Why do we have to? But then we said, all right, let's write down the prediction. Oh, look, nothing should happen. So that's consistent with what we find, particularly sort of once we control for Islamic religion, the differences all disappear, both in terms of the levels and the elasticity to schools, where we can't rule out that these effects are the same, and if at all, they're concentrated in the groups that is larger, which is the non-bride price group. Okay, so to wrap up this first page, oh, yes, one more. And I'm really hoping this means I'm getting more minutes at the end, but I'm going to need to bargain a little.
Sorry, my question is, you mentioned that households within a region can vary. In some households practice bride price, some households don't. So just to clarify, like, marriage matching happens only within these groups. So even within the same region, like, brides and grooms are only being matched across households that are, or within households that have the same view of bride price.
This is a great question, but I have a question back to you. Do you mean in theory or in practice?
Well,
both.
Yeah.
Okay, so in theory, we assume that you can only marry somebody who has the same bride price tradition as you do. In practice, that is quite consistent with what we see in the data, especially in Zambia, but to a large extent also in Indonesia. So even though there's a fair amount of marriage between different ethnic groups, once you categorize ethnic groups for whether they practice bride price or not, according to what anthropologists see, you find that only 16% of couples in Indonesia and less than 5% in Zambia marry across this sort of line, this bride price line. And so that's why. So both was clearly in the model, but also in the data, that's the case. Thanks. All right. So just to summarize this first paper, we documented that there might be incentives coming from the marriage market that encourage education, and the fact that this bride price institution exists allows the parents to capture these incentives, and so might encourage a woman's education. So when you look quantitatively about how large the returns in terms of bride price is and how that translates into an education increase, we're actually within the ballpark of literature on, say, conditional cash transfer programs and so on. And so we also then interpret these bride price payments not just as a marriage market transfer, but also as an intergenerational transfer. So to us, this was very new, and I think in the economics literature, we hadn't found any paper that had explored this channel. But then we went back to Gary Becker's book on Treatise on the Family, and we found a footnote where, without having to go to Zambia like we did for years and so on, he had already predicted all of this. Because he did say in this footnote something along the lines of, oh, and by the way, these payments can capture some of the characteristics of the bride and groom. They might also act as incentives to undertake human capital investments. So that was quite a thrilling discovery when we found that footnote, which I'm sure we had seen before. So, but that we were happy to find. And then sort of the last point, which I think ties more also to the value of trying to combine economic data with ethnographic data, is that when you're thinking about evaluating policy, like the expansion of schools, it might be important to consider not just incentives coming from labor market and other economic factors, but also incentives coming from culture and institutions, and so you really need to know a lot about your context. This brings me quite directly then to the next paper, which I'll talk about quite briefly to stay on time, but that I think emphasizes this point even further, and again looks at the role of traditional marriage payments in shaping economic decisions. The main outcome variable that we're interested in, though, in this case, is female age of marriage, and in particular, child marriage, which is defined as marriage below the age of 18. It's a very common phenomenon around the world, where about 40% of adult women today having married before turning 18. There is a wide body of literature in public health and in economics pointing out that early marriage is associated with very adverse outcomes, both for women and for their children. We also know from the data that there exists a pretty clear correlation between early marriage and poverty. And that's not only true in terms of across countries, it is often the poorest countries where you'll see more child marriage. It's also within the poorest country, the poorest of all households. And so in this paper, which is joint with Lucia Corno and Nicole Hildebrand, we start by asking the question, how do aggregate economic conditions affect the occurrence of child marriage? So that was our initial question. It turned out that the answer is quite complex, and so it gave us a chance to dive again into marriage payments and culture and heterogeneity due to culture and institutions. And so in this case, unlike in the previous paper where we only focused on 2 countries, we're going to use data from throughout sub-Saharan Africa, as well as data from India, where dowry payments, so we're going to have data also from a dowry country. There's also some dowry practice in Eritrea. We'll have countries that mostly practice dowry and countries where bride price is practiced to a different extent. And so we're interested in asking, how do economic conditions, and in particular, how do economic shocks affect the decision to have your daughter marry early as a child, which, as we know, has several adverse implications, so that affects the decision of households. So, and for that, I'm going to go back to our Econ 200, more or less, in the sense that, at the end of the day, it is a supply and demand story to some extent. So, to summarize, what's the basic idea here? So imagine that you as a family are exposed to a recession. And we're going to describe recessions as the occurrence of a drought. So it's just a 1 year or 2 year sort of short period where your income is very low. So if you expect to receive a payment if your daughter marries, you value that income payment more when you're poorer. That's because your utility function is concave, and so you have higher marginal utility of consumption when your income is low. You basically might need that payment to make ends meet. What does that mean is that as the bride price increases, more families of a woman want their daughter to marry, so we have upward sloping supply of brides, but this curve shifts upward when income is low. So this would be a time, this line may represent a time of economic expansion, and this could represent a recession. So that's an easy thing to expect in an economy where there's a bride price, so you get a payment for your daughter. The problem, or sort of what makes this question complex, is that you also have another side of the market, which is the groom side, that needs to be making that payment. And the problem for them is the opposite. You might want to delay marriage because you might not want to have to make a payment in a time where you have high marginal utility of consumption, so in a time of recession. So it means that the demand for brides would shift from the line that captures the expansion period to a lower line that captures the recession. What happens in equilibrium when supply and demand meet? Well, we should expect the prices to be lowest, and what happens to the quantity depends on the relative slope of these lines. And we show in this paper that to the extent that sons tend to support their families more, particularly in times of recessions, compared to daughters, we should expect quantities to clear with more child marriage occurring in equilibrium in bride price economies. Flip that problem to some extent simply by changing the sign of which way the marriage transfer goes. And now you have the opposite diagrams, meaning now the supply is downward sloped, supply of brides under dowry. The demand for brides is upward slope, and the equilibrium is opposite. It's going to say if you're in a dowry economy, you should expect that during a recession, transfers will be lower, the value of dowry paid will be lower, but you'll see fewer child marriages occurring in equilibrium under the same assumptions that we did in the bride price case. So this is telling us basically that there is not a one answer fits all problem here. It's a complex problem that depends basically on the way in which the marriage market works. So in an economy with bride price, we should expect an increase in child marriage. In an economy with dowry, a decrease. That's something that we can test empirically. And so that's what we do. That's sort of most of what we do in the end in the paper is bringing this intuition to the data. So to do that, we combine, I'll take 2 more minutes since we got a lot of questions, but so we combine data from throughout sub-Saharan Africa and India for 400,000 women, and depending on their location, we will merge it to rainfall data to know whether they were exposed to droughts when in their teenage years. So that's exercise allows them to study whether the occurrence of a drought, this will be our regression equation, affects the hazard into getting married as a teenager, controlling for your location, your age, and your year of birth. And so what we predict is, in fact, what we see in the data. The occurrence of a drought makes the hazard into marriage both up to age 25 and up to age 17 in particular. So I'll focus on this case, which is the child marriage effect, by 3%, and increases that hazard by 3% in sub-Saharan Africa and decreases it by 4% in India. So that's our main result, and then we spend a lot of time in the paper arguing that this effect is concentrated where indeed these bride price payments are made in line with our theory. And also, I just want to, I think it's quite important to emphasize the fact that these women marry earlier leads to also have children earlier and end up having more children by the time they're adults. So has kind of this one-time shock has long-time effects on their economic outcomes. To wrap up, in the interest of time, one thing that we want to emphasize from these results is if we had just conducted our analysis in sub-Saharan Africa, we would have maybe wanted to suggest that supporting household income during recessions, during times of shortage, is a valuable strategy to contain child marriage. The problem is if you take that policy that you've designed in one context without knowing what the underlying mechanisms are, you might want to recommend that same policy in India, and then you get the exact opposite effect. Then you would see that you increase child marriage rather than reducing it. So there's a lot of value, in my view, and I think in the view of lots of empirical economists, of replicating, not only of replicating results in different contexts, but also in investing in understanding the economic mechanisms that explain your effects. So answers are often much more complex than our first cut of the data would suggest. And also, if we want to reduce child marriage, which is a big priority of UNICEF and of many international organizations, understanding the role of this traditional institution and how they interact with the economy is a very important goal. So that's something that we emphasize in the paper. So I stole those 2 extra minutes at the end, but my talk is done. But obviously, I'm very happy to take your questions, and thanks for the attention.